Welcome. You've reached a place where history unfolds slowly, one quiet story at a time. So settle into a comfortable position, dim the lights if you haven't already, and let the distractions of today fade into the background. There's nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do except listen. Together, we'll wander through forgotten civilizations, remarkable journeys, and the everyday lives of people who came long before us. Take a slow, comfortable breath, relax, and let the past gently carry you toward sleep. Somewhere beneath the green canopy of what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador, there once stood a world of stone cities, quiet plazas, and carved stairways that climbed toward the sky. Tonight, we are going to move slowly through that world, following it from its height to its quiet transformation, without any rush, and without needing to reach any particular ending. You can let your mind drift in and out as we go. Nothing here requires your full attention. It is simply here, unfolding gently, the way a river moves without needing anyone to watch it. The people we now call the Maya did not think of themselves as a single empire in the way that, say, the Romans understood their own reach. They were instead a shared civilization, a network of independent city-states spread across a landscape of dense rainforest, limestone hills, and wide seasonal wetlands. They spoke related languages, worshipped related gods, watched the same stars, and built with the same underlying architectural language, even while their kings competed with one another, married into rival dynasties, and occasionally went to war. It's worth sitting with that picture for a moment. Not one empire, but many cities, each with its own rulers, its own patron gods, its own version of the shared Maya worldview, all breathing in the same humid air of the same forested world. This civilization did not appear suddenly. Its roots reach back more than 3,000 years into small farming villages that slowly grew more complex, developing shared traditions of building, of recording time, and of honoring rulers as intermediaries between the human world and the sacred one. By the time we reach what archaeologists now call the Classic Period, roughly from 250 to 900 of the Common Era, Maya civilization had reached a level of sophistication that still quietly astonishes people who study it closely. Cities held tens of thousands of residents. Some regions supported population densities that rival modern agricultural landscapes. Stone temples rose in stepped pyramids above the tree line, their limestone faces once covered in painted plaster, red and white and blue, catching the early morning light before the humidity and centuries wore that color away. Let your breathing settle into a slow rhythm as we walk, in our imagination, into one of these cities at its height. Picture a plaza at dawn. The stone is still cool from the night. Smoke rises gently from a few hearths at the edges of the city, where families are beginning to grind maize for the morning meal. Above them, on raised platforms, stand the temples and palaces of the ruling family, oriented with careful attention to the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planet Venus, which the Maya tracked with remarkable precision. The whole city was, in a sense, an instrument for measuring time, built from stone rather than metal or glass, and calibrated to the sky rather than to a clock. Maya society was layered, much like many ancient civilizations, with a king or queen at the top, understood not simply as a political ruler, but as a sacred figure who could communicate with ancestors and gods through ritual, sometimes through bloodletting ceremonies, sometimes through elaborate public performances timed to calendar events. Beneath the royal family sat a class of nobles, priests, and scribes, the last of whom held one of the most intellectually demanding roles in the ancient world. Maya scribes developed a writing system combining logograms, which represent whole words, with syllabic signs, which represent sounds. It was, and remains, one of the most complete writing systems developed anywhere in the ancient Americas, capable of recording not just religious ideas, but history, astronomy, and the personal names and deeds of specific rulers. Beneath the nobility were skilled artisans, farmers, and laborers, whose daily lives, though far less recorded in stone, formed the true foundation upon which everything else depended. The vast majority of Maya people were farmers, tending fields of maize, beans, and squash using techniques adapted carefully to the particular soils and rainfall patterns of their region. In some areas, this meant simple swidden or slash-and-burn agriculture, clearing small plots and rotating them over years. In others, particularly in wetter lowland zones, Maya farmers built raised fields and canals, engineering the landscape itself to manage water and improve fertility, a level of environmental modification that took centuries of accumulated knowledge to perfect. It's worth pausing here, in this early, unhurried part of our journey, to appreciate just how varied the Maya world was geographically, because that variation will matter later when we speak about how different regions experienced change in different ways and at different times. The Maya lowlands stretch across a limestone shelf, meaning that for much of the region, there are very few rivers or lakes on the surface. Water instead moves underground through porous stone, occasionally surfacing in natural sinkholes called cenotes, which held both practical and deeply spiritual importance. In other zones, particularly toward the south and west, rivers such as the Usumacinta cut through the landscape, providing both water and trade routes that linked cities across long distances. Toward the highlands of what is now Guatemala, the terrain rises into volcanic mountains, cooler and drier, home to different crops, different building materials, and somewhat different cultural rhythms. Though still connected to the lowland cities through trade and shared religious ideas, this geographic diversity meant that Maya civilization was never a single uniform thing responding to a single set of conditions. A city built beside a permanent river had a very different relationship with its environment than than a city relying entirely on rainfall collected in reservoirs. This distinction will become important as we move later through the story of decline, because what happened to the Maya world was not one single collapse happening everywhere at once, but rather a long, uneven, regionally varied transformation, unfolding over generations, in some places sudden, in other places so gradual it would have been almost impossible to notice while living through it. For now, though, we remain in the world at its height. Trade connected Maya cities to one another and to civilizations far beyond their borders. Jade, prized above almost any other material, traveled from a handful of specific source regions to royal workshops throughout the Maya world, where it was carved into ornaments worn by kings and queens as symbols of life, breath, and fertility. Obsidian, a volcanic glass sharp enough to be used for blades and ceremonial tools, moved along similar trade networks from highland volcanic sources. Cacao, the source of chocolate, was cultivated and consumed as a ceremonial and elite beverage, often flavored with chili and other spices. And cacao beans themselves sometimes functioned as a form of currency. Feathers from tropical birds, particularly the brilliant green tail feathers of the resplendent quetzal, were reserved for royal headdresses, and the birds were carefully kept alive during the plucking process, since killing them was considered a waste of something sacred. The Maya calendar system deserves a slow moment of attention here, because it reflects something essential about how this civilization understood time itself. Rather than a single calendar, Maya society used several interlocking systems simultaneously. There was the 260-day ritual calendar, known to modern scholars as the Tzolk'in, used primarily for divination and ceremonial timing. There was also a 365-day solar calendar, the Hob, tracking the agricultural and seasonal year. When combined, these two cycles created a longer repeating pattern of 52 years, known as the calendar round. And for tracking longer spans of history, particularly the reigns of kings and significant historical events, Maya scribes used the long count, a linear system capable of recording dates across thousands of years with remarkable precision. It is through long count inscriptions, carved onto stone monuments called stelae, that modern researchers have been able to reconstruct detailed political histories, including the names of specific rulers, their battles, their marriages, and the dates of their accessions to the throne. If you are still awake and listening at this point, there is no need to hold onto every detail. Let the images settle rather than the specifics. A city of layered stone rising from the forest floor. Farmers moving through fields at dawn. Scribes bent over painted bark paper, recording the movements of Venus. Traders carrying jade and cacao along forest paths between cities that, though politically independent, shared a single language of stars, symbols, and sacred time. This was the Maya world in its period height, a civilization that would eventually produce more than 40 major city-states across the lowlands, each with its own dynasty, its own temples, and its own particular relationship to the land beneath it. In the segments that follow, we will move gently through specific regions and specific cities, beginning with the great rivalry between two of the largest classic period powers, and slowly working our way, city by city, century by century, toward the long, quiet transformation that scholars now describe not simply as a collapse, but as one of the more complex and still debated processes in the archaeology of the ancient world. There is no need to anticipate where that story leads. For now, it is enough to simply rest in this early picture, a civilization at its height, breathing slowly in the warm lowland air, its temples catching the first light of another ordinary morning. Welcome back if you're still here, or welcome for the first time if you're just settling in. Either way, there's nothing you need to have remembered from before. We're going to move now into the heart of the Maya lowlands, toward two cities whose long rivalry shaped much of classic period history. Their names are Tikal and Calakmul, and for several centuries, the story of the Maya world was, in many ways, the story of these two powers and the smaller kingdoms caught between them. Tikal rises from the forest of what is now northern Guatemala, in the region known as the Petén. Even today, its temples break through the tree canopy, tall limestone pyramids that seem to float above a green sea when viewed from above. At its height, Tikal may have supported a population of perhaps 60,000 people or more within its urban core, with many more living in the surrounding countryside that depended on the city for trade, ritual, and protection. Its rulers traced their dynasty back for centuries, and its temples, particularly the towering structures now known simply as Temple I and Temple II, still stand as some of the most recognizable Maya monuments in the world. Calakmul, by contrast, sits somewhat further north, across the modern border in the Mexican state of Campeche, hidden even more deeply within dense forest that today forms one of the largest protected rainforest reserves in the region. Its ruling dynasty called themselves the Canal, meaning something like the snake or serpent lineage. And over the course of the 6th and 7th centuries, this dynasty built one of the most extensive political networks in the entire Maya world, forming alliances, and when necessary, going to war with smaller kingdoms across a wide stretch of the lowlands. It is worth sitting for a moment with what Maya warfare actually looked like during this period, because it differed considerably from the popular image many people carry of ancient conflict. Maya warfare in the classic period was often deeply ritualized, closely tied to calendar cycles and religious obligation, and frequently aimed less at territorial conquest in the way we might imagine from later European history, and more at capturing specific high-status individuals, particularly rival rulers or nobles, who could then be displayed, humiliated in ritual context, and in some cases sacrificed as part of ceremonies, affirming the victor's connection to sacred power. This is not to say Maya warfare was gentle. It carried real consequences, including the burning of temples, the toppling of monuments, and genuine loss of life. But the underlying logic was often as much about prestige, ritual dominance, and dynastic legitimacy as it was about controlling farmland or extracting tribute. Though tribute and trade access certainly mattered as well, the rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul unfolded across roughly a century and a half, involving a shifting web of allied and enemy city-states, including Karakal, Dus Pilas, Naranjo, and others, each drawn into the larger conflict through marriage alliances, military obligation, or simple geographic proximity. In the middle of the 6th century, Calakmul and its allies inflicted a significant defeat upon Tikal, one severe enough that Tikal's own historical monuments fall largely silent for more than a century afterward, a period sometimes referred to by researchers as Tikal's hiatus. During this time, Calakmul's influence expanded considerably, and its rulers positioned themselves at the center of a wide alliance network stretching across much of the central and southern lowlands. Tikal, however, did not remain silent forever. In the year 695 of the Common Era, under a ruler known to history as Chichén I, Tikal achieved a decisive victory over Calakmul, capturing important war relics, and, according to inscriptions from the period, humiliating Calakmul's ruling dynasty in ways recorded with evident satisfaction on Tikal's own monuments. This victory marked the beginning of what scholars sometimes call Tikal's Renaissance, a period of renewed building, renewed political influence, and renewed confidence, expressed through some of the most ambitious architecture in the city's long history, including the great temple pyramids, whose silhouettes are now so widely recognized. It's worth taking a slow breath here and considering what daily life might have looked like for the ordinary residents of these two great rival cities. People whose names were never carved onto any monument, but whose labor and lives made these cities function. In Tikal, as in most Maya urban centers, the majority of residents lived not within the grand stone plazas at the city's core, but in surrounding residential zones, in houses built from perishable materials such as wood, thatch, and packed earth, arranged around small family courtyards. These homes have mostly vanished from the archaeological record, leaving behind only their stone foundations and the artifacts once used within them. Fragments of pottery, obsidian blades, grinding stones for processing maize. Family life would have followed the rhythms of the agricultural year, with maize planting and harvest marking the major turning points, punctuated by religious festivals tied to the ritual calendar, market days, when goods from across the region would be traded in open plazas, and periodic labor obligations, when farmers and craftspeople might be called upon to contribute work toward the construction of a new temple or the maintenance of a reservoir. Water management, in fact, was one of the great quiet engineering achievements of cities like Tikal, and it deserves a slow, careful mention because it will matter again later in our story. Tikal sits atop porous limestone with no permanent river nearby, meaning its entire population depended on captured rainwater for survival through the dry months of the year. Maya engineers responded to this challenge by constructing an elaborate system of paved plazas designed to funnel rainwater into a network of large reservoirs, some of them capable of holding enormous quantities of water, carefully plastered to prevent seepage into the porous bedrock below. This system represented centuries of accumulated hydrological knowledge, and it allowed Tikal to sustain a large urban population in a location that, without such engineering, would have struggled to support even a fraction of its actual size. Calakmul faced similar environmental constraints and developed its own network of reservoirs and water management systems, though somewhat differently adapted to its particular local terrain. Both cities, in other words, were triumphs of environmental adaptation, as much as they were centers of political and religious power. Cities that had learned, over many generations, how to make a demanding tropical landscape reliably support dense human settlement. As the 7th century gave way to the 8th, the rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul gradually softened, not through any single dramatic event, but through a slow redistribution of power across the wider Maya world. Other cities, some of which we will visit in later segments, began to rise in prominence, and the old bipolar rivalry between these two giants gave way to a more complex, multipolar political landscape, with numerous mid-sized kingdoms asserting greater independence and engaging in their own webs of alliance and conflict. By the mid-8th century, both Tikal and Calakmul remained large, wealthy, and architecturally impressive cities. But the singular dominance either had once held over the wider region had diminished considerably. It's worth noting gently that this shift was not itself the collapse we will be discussing in later segments. This was simply the normal ebb and flow of political power within a long-lived civilization, not unlike the way dominant kingdoms or city-states rose and fell across many centuries in other parts of the ancient world, in Mesopotamia, in the Mediterranean, in East Asia. Political rivalries begin, intensify, resolve, and eventually give way to new configurations of power. What makes the later Maya story distinctive is not this earlier pattern of rivalry and rebalancing, but rather what happened afterward, when a much broader and more fundamental set of pressures began to reshape the entire southern lowland region in ways that no earlier period of Maya history had experienced. For now, though, we can simply rest in this picture of two great cities, each with its own temples rising above the canopy, each supported by careful engineering that turned rainfall into reservoirs, each home to tens of thousands of people whose daily lives moved through the familiar rhythms of planting, harvest, market days, and festival, largely unaware, as most people living through any particular century tend to be, of how their world might look centuries later to those who would eventually walk among the quiet ruins of their temples, listening to birdsong where court ceremonies once unfolded, and wondering what daily life here had actually felt like. In our next segment, we'll travel further toward the eastern edges of the Maya world, to the city of Copán, nestled among river valleys and mountains, where a very different set of environmental relationships shaped one of the most artistically distinctive Maya kingdoms. We move now toward the eastern edge of the Maya world, into a landscape quite different from the flat limestone forests of Tikal and Calakmul. Here, in what is now western Honduras, the land folds into a series of river valleys surrounded by mountains. And it is in one of these valleys, along the banks of the Copán River, that we find one of the most artistically remarkable of all Maya cities. You don't need to hold on to every name or every date here. Just let the shape of this different landscape settle into your mind. A valley among mountains, quieter and more enclosed than the vast forest canopy we left behind. Copán's location placed it at something of a cultural crossroads. It sat near the southeastern frontier of the Maya cultural sphere, close to regions influenced by other Mesoamerican and Central American cultures. And this position seems to have shaped Copán into a city with its own distinctive artistic voice, even while remaining firmly part of the broader Maya world in its writing system, its calendar, and its religious practices. The valley itself offered fertile alluvial soil along the riverbanks, a real advantage compared to the thinner, rockier soils found in much of the northern lowlands. And this agricultural richness allowed Copán to support a substantial population within a relatively compact and well-defined territory. The founding of Copán's ruling dynasty is recorded, according to later inscriptions, as having taken place in the year 426 of the Common Era, when a ruler remembered by the name K-Inish Yaxkayuk Mo established the royal line that would govern the city for the next 4 centuries. Interestingly, later isotopic analysis of skeletal remains believed to belong to this founding ruler suggests he may have come from outside the immediate region, possibly from the area around Tikal or another major lowland center, reflecting the way classic period Maya political power often moved along established networks of trade, marriage, and shared elite culture rather than remaining strictly local. This single detail offers a gentle reminder of just how interconnected the Maya world truly was, with ruling families, artistic styles, and religious ideas moving fluidly between cities separated by considerable distance. Copán is perhaps best known today for its extraordinary sculptural tradition. While while many Maya cities carved their historical and religious inscriptions, primarily in flat relief on stone stele. Copán's artisans developed a distinctive three-dimensional carving style, producing figures and hieroglyphs that seem almost to emerge fully rounded from the stone itself, rather than remaining flat against its surface. Walking through Copán's central plaza, even today, visitors encounter a series of stelae depicting past rulers with remarkable individualized detail. Their faces, headdresses, and ceremonial regalia carved with a precision and artistic ambition that many scholars consider unmatched elsewhere in the Maya world. The city's most famous monument, however, is neither a stela nor a temple, but a stairway. Known today as the hieroglyphic stairway, this monument consists of 63 steps, each carved with rows of glyphs, together forming the longest known Maya hieroglyphic text, containing more than 2,200 individual glyph blocks. The stairway recounts the dynastic history of Copán's rulers, and those centuries of subsidence, earthquake damage, and early, well-intentioned but imprecise restoration efforts have left many of its blocks out of their original order, creating a genuine and ongoing puzzle for modern epigraphers. It remains an extraordinary testament to how seriously Copán's rulers took the recording and preservation of their own political and dynastic history. Let's slow down here for a moment and consider the broader role that ancestor veneration played in Maya political life, because it helps explain why a monument like the hieroglyphic stairway existed at all. For Maya rulers, legitimacy did not rest solely on military strength or economic control, though both certainly mattered. Legitimacy also rested heavily on demonstrated, documented connection to a sacred and unbroken royal lineage, reaching back to a city's founding ruler, and through him or her, back further still to the gods themselves. Public monuments recording the names, dates, and deeds of past kings were not simply historical records in the way we might think of a modern archive. They were active tools of political and religious legitimacy, reaffirming generation after generation that the current ruler stood within an unbroken chain of sacred authority stretching back through time. Copán's later history includes a period of real political tension, worth mentioning gently, since it offers an early, localized preview of tensions that would later appear more broadly across the Maya world. In the year 738, Copán's ruler, known as Uxaklajun Abake was captured, and according to inscriptions, ritually killed by the ruler of a smaller subordinate city called Quirigá, located along a river valley some distance away. This event represented an extraordinary reversal, a subordinate city defeating and humiliating its more powerful neighbor, and it illustrates something important about classic period Maya politics that will matter as our story continues. Even at the height of Maya civilization, political power was never entirely stable or permanently fixed. Smaller kingdoms could and did assert independence, sometimes successfully, when opportunity or shifting alliances allowed. Copán recovered from this setback under later rulers, who oversaw a further period of construction and artistic achievement. But historians studying the city's later inscriptions have noted a gradual thinning of information as the 8th century progressed. Fewer new monuments, less elaborate building projects, and eventually, in the final years of the dynasty, inscriptions that seem to reflect growing uncertainty or reduced royal authority. Copán's final known ruler is recorded taking the throne in the year 763. And while the city did not vanish immediately afterward, its role as a major dynastic capital effectively concluded not long after. Its last major dated monument raised in the early 9th century. It's worth pausing to notice, without any urgency, that this pattern we're beginning to see repeated is not a single event, but rather a kind of quiet rhythm, appearing city by city at different times, in different ways. We do not yet fully understand, and scholars continue to debate exactly why this particular period saw so many classic period dynasties experience similar patterns of declining monument construction and eventual dynastic silence, though we will explore several of the leading explanations more fully in later segments. Once we've had the chance to walk through several more of these cities and notice, gently, how the pattern varies and repeats across the wider landscape, Copán also offers modern researchers something particularly valuable. Because unlike many Maya sites where environmental evidence has been harder to recover, the valley's geology and hydrology have preserved unusually detailed records of ancient environmental conditions, including evidence of soil erosion and deforestation in the surrounding hillsides during the city's later centuries. Some researchers have proposed that population growth in the valley, combined with the clearing of forest on increasingly steep and vulnerable slopes to make way for agriculture, may have led to soil degradation that reduced the valley's long-term agricultural capacity, placing gradual pressure on a population that had grown to depend on the valley's fertility. This evidence remains a subject of ongoing research and is not universally accepted as the primary explanation for Copán's political decline. But it offers one thread among several that we will draw together more fully when we turn our full attention to environmental context in a later segment. For now, we can simply sit with the image of this valley, quieter and more enclosed than the great lowland forests, its river moving steadily past terraces once carefully tended by farming families, its central plaza filled with stone portraits of rulers who wished, quite understandably, to be remembered, and its long hieroglyphic stairway, its steps now slightly out of order, still patiently recording a history that took modern researchers decades of careful, painstaking work to even begin to piece back together. In the next segment, we will travel westward, following the great river systems that connected the Maya lowlands toward the elegant, spring-fed city of Palenque, where a very different relationship between architecture, water, and royal ideology unfolded along the edge of the forested hills. We travel now toward the western reaches of the Maya lowlands, into a region of low forested hills where natural springs emerge from the limestone and feed a series of small, clear streams down toward the great Usumacinta River in the distance. It is here, along the edge of these hills, that we find Palenque, a city whose architecture reflects, perhaps more than any other classic period center, a close and thoughtful relationship between building design and the movement of water through its landscape. You can let this image settle slowly. Not the dense, flat forest of Tikal, not the enclosed river valley of Copán, but a gently sloped hillside city with streams running directly beneath and between its temples. Palenque's builders made an unusual and technically impressive choice in how they integrated the city's architecture with its water sources, rather than diverting or ignoring the small river that ran through the settlement, known today as the Achalam. Palenque's engineers constructed a vaulted stone aqueduct that carried the river's water beneath the city's central plaza, allowing temples and palace structures to be built directly above the flowing water, while still keeping the surface areas dry and usable for ceremony and daily activity. This kind of engineering, channeling a natural watercourse underground through carefully constructed stone vaulting, represents one of the more sophisticated hydraulic achievements found anywhere in the ancient Maya world. And it speaks to a broader pattern we've now seen repeated in different forms in each city we visited. An intimate, carefully studied relationship between Maya builders and the specific water conditions of their local landscape. Palenque reached its height under a ruler whose long reign remains one of the best documented in all of Maya history. His name was Inish Janub Pakal, sometimes referred to simply as Pakal the Great, and he ascended to the throne as a young child in the year 615, ultimately ruling for 68 years, one of the longest reigns recorded anywhere in the ancient Maya world. Under Pakal's long rule and that of his immediate successors, Palenque underwent an extraordinary building program, including the construction of the Temple of the Inscriptions, a stepped pyramid that would later prove to hold one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Maya studies. In 1952, Mexican archaeologist Alberto Rusliulier, working carefully and patiently over several field seasons, discovered a hidden stairway descending from the temple's summit down into the pyramid's core, eventually leading to a sealed chamber deep within the structure. Inside, he found an elaborately carved sarcophagus containing the remains of a man later identified through careful correlation with hieroglyphic inscriptions as Pakal himself. The sarcophagus lid remains one of the most studied, and in more recent decades, most popularly reinterpreted pieces of Maya art in the world, carved with an image showing Pakal at the moment of his death. Positioned at the boundary between the world of the living and the underworld, surrounded by symbols representing the sacred ceiba tree, understood by the Maya to connect the layers of the cosmos, its roots reaching into the underworld and its branches extending into the heavens. This discovery mattered enormously for the field of Maya archaeology, not only because of the richness of the burial itself, jade masks, jewelry, and offerings carefully arranged around the king's remains, but because it definitively demonstrated that Maya pyramids, long assumed by some earlier researchers to function purely as platforms for surface temples, could also serve as elaborate funerary monuments, deliberately constructed to house and honor the remains of specific rulers within their very core. This insight reshaped how archaeologists approached pyramid excavation across the entire Maya region in the decades that followed. Under Pakal's son and successor, Canbalem II, Palenque continued its ambitious building program, constructing what is now known as the Group of the Cross, 3 temples arranged around a plaza, each dedicated to a different patron deity, and each containing extensive hieroglyphic texts recounting both mythological history stretching back to the origins of the gods themselves, and the more recent political history of Palenque's ruling dynasty. This blending of deep mythological time with recent dynastic history was a common feature of Maya royal inscriptions generally, reflecting the belief that current rulers existed within a continuous, unbroken narrative stretching from the actions of the gods at the beginning of time through to the present ceremonial moment being recorded on the temple wall. Palenque's political relationships extended westward along the Usumacinta River toward other significant kingdoms, including Yaxchilan and Piedras Negras, 2 cities that maintained their own complex, sometimes cooperative and sometimes antagonistic relationship with one another across the river that separated them, and with Palenque further downstream. Yaxchilan, in particular, developed its own distinctive artistic tradition centered on elaborately carved stone lintels, positioned above doorways, depicting scenes of royal bloodletting, ritual, warfare, and dynastic ceremony, with an intimacy and narrative detail that offers modern researchers unusually rich insight into the personal and ceremonial lives of specific historical rulers and their family members, including several notable and powerful royal women whose political roles are recorded with particular clarity in Yaxchilan's inscriptions. It's worth taking a slow, unhurried moment here to consider the role of women within classic period Maya royal politics more broadly, since this is a topic that deserves gentle attention rather than a passing mention. While Maya political structures generally favored male rulers, royal women held genuine and, in certain periods and certain cities, quite significant political influence. Women served as regents during periods when heirs were too young to rule directly, participated actively in the bloodletting rituals central to royal religious practice, and in a small but historically important number of cases, ruled directly in their own right as queens. Inscriptions from several cities, including some we have already discussed, and others we have yet to visit, record women identified with royal titles typically reserved for kings, suggesting that under particular political circumstances, dynastic continuity through a capable female ruler was considered preferable to the alternative of an unclear or contested succession. As the 8th century progressed, Palenque, like Copán before it in our journey, began to show signs of a familiar pattern. A gradual reduction in new monument construction, fewer detailed inscriptions, and eventually a marked thinning of the historical record as we approach the century's end. The city's last securely dated inscription comes from the early 9th century, after which Palenque, like so many of its neighboring lowland cities, gradually fades from the written record, its temples and palaces left to the slow, patient work of the surrounding forest, which would eventually grow up through and around its plazas, its roots gently working their way between carved stones over the centuries that followed, until careful modern excavation began, many hundreds of years later, to clear the vegetation and reveal once more the architecture that had lain quietly beneath it. We should sit for a moment, without any urgency, with the fact that we have now walked through 3 quite different Maya cities, Tikal and Calakmul in the dense lowland forest, Copán in its enclosed mountain valley, and now Palenque along its spring-fed hillside. And in each case, we have noticed the same underlying rhythm appearing near the end of the 8th century and into the early 9th. Fewer monuments, quieter inscriptions, a gradual withdrawal of the kind of grand royal building projects that had defined these cities for centuries. This is not yet the full picture, and there is still a great deal of nuance to add, including cities that did not follow this pattern at all, and regions that continued to flourish long after the southern lowland centers grew quiet. But it is worth letting this repeated rhythm settle gently into your awareness as we continue. A pattern we will examine much more closely from several different angles once we have visited a few more cities and gathered a fuller picture of just how widely and how unevenly this long transformation actually unfolded. In our next segment, we will turn to consider the broader physical landscape itself, the rivers, the rainfall patterns, the agricultural systems that supported all of these cities, before returning to the historical narrative with a clearer sense of the environmental foundation upon which this entire civilization had been built. For this next stretch of our journey, we're going to step back from the individual histories of specific cities and rulers, and instead settle into a broader, quieter view of the physical world that made all of those cities possible in the first place. There's no need to hold onto specific names here. This segment is more like looking at a landscape from a slow-moving boat, watching the terrain shift gradually beneath you, rather than walking through a single, particular place. Let yourself sink into that wider, calmer perspective, the Maya lowlands, as we touched on briefly at the very beginning of our journey together, sit atop a vast shelf of limestone, formed over millions of years from the compressed remains of ancient marine life, laid down when this entire region lay beneath a shallow sea. This underlying geology shaped nearly everything about how Maya civilization developed, because limestone is a porous, permeable stone, meaning that rainwater falling on the surface tends to sink quickly downward through cracks and channels in the rock into an underground water table, rather than collecting into rivers and lakes the way it might on less porous terrain. Across much of the central and northern lowlands, this meant that surface water was often scarce or entirely absent for much of the year, even in a region that received substantial seasonal rainfall. This single geological fact explains a great deal about the ingenuity we've already encountered in our journey so far. The reservoirs of Tikal, the underground aqueduct of Palenque, and it will help us understand, later in this segment, some of the deeper vulnerabilities that this same geology quietly built into Maya civilization as a whole. Where limestone allowed water to seep away quickly, Maya communities responded with engineering. Reservoirs to capture rainfall before it could sink into the bedrock, cisterns cut directly into the stone, and in some regions, careful use of natural sinkholes, called cenotes in the Yucatec Maya language, where the limestone ceiling of an underground water channel had collapsed, exposing a pool of water at the surface. Cenotes held both deeply practical and deeply spiritual significance, serving as reliable water sources in otherwise dry landscapes, while also functioning as sacred sites, understood as portals to the underworld, where ceremonial offerings, and in some documented cases, human remains associated with ritual practice, have been recovered by modern archaeologists and underwater researchers working carefully within these submerged cave systems. Rainfall itself, across the Maya region, follows a pronounced seasonal pattern, with a wet season generally running from roughly May through October, and a pronounced dry season for the remaining months of the year. This seasonality meant that Maya agriculture, regardless of the specific farming techniques used in any particular region, had to be carefully timed around this annual rhythm, planting maize at the very start of the rains, and managing stored water and stored harvested grain carefully enough to sustain a population through the long, dry months when little or no rain would fall at all. Even a single season of unusually delayed or unusually light rainfall could meaningfully strain a community's stored food and water reserves. A run of several such difficult years in succession, though rare, could pose a far more serious challenge, one that even sophisticated water and agricultural engineering might struggle to fully absorb. Maize itself deserves a slow, appreciative pause here, because it stood at the very center of Maya subsistence culture, and even cosmology. Maya mythology, recorded in later post-classic texts, such as the Popol Vuh, describes humanity itself as having been formed from maize dough by the creator gods, after earlier, less successful attempts using mud and wood had failed to produce beings capable of properly honoring their creators. This origin story reflects, in mythological form, just how central maize truly was to Maya identity and daily survival. Maize was typically grown alongside beans and squash, a combination sometimes referred to in broader Mesoamerican context as the Three Sisters, where beans fix nitrogen in the soil, benefiting the heavy nitrogen demands of maize, while squash spreads low across the ground, helping to suppress weeds and retain soil moisture. This combination, developed and refined over many centuries, provided a nutritionally balanced and agriculturally efficient foundation for Maya subsistence across a wide range of environmental conditions. Different regions of the Maya world adapted their agricultural techniques to their particular local landscape, and it's worth moving slowly through a few of these variations, since they help explain why different regions would later experience environmental pressure in different ways and to different degrees. In much of the central lowland forest, farmers practiced a system often called swidden or shifting agriculture, clearing a plot of forest, burning the cleared vegetation to enrich the soil with ash, planting for a few years until soil fertility declined, and then allowing the plot to lie fallow, sometimes for many years, while forest regrowth gradually restored its fertility before eventually returning to farm it again. This system worked reasonably well at lower population densities, where enough surrounding forest remained available to support a long fallow cycle. But as Maya cities grew larger and denser, particularly during the height of the classic period, the amount of land available for long fallow periods in many regions grew increasingly scarce, pushing farmers toward shorter fallow cycles, more intensive use of available land, and in some regions, entirely different agricultural strategies altogether. In wetter, low-lying areas, particularly in parts of northern Belize and portions of the southern lowlands near rivers and seasonal wetlands, Maya farmers developed systems of raised fields, constructing elevated planting platforms surrounded by drainage canals. This technique offered several advantages, improving drainage in areas prone to seasonal flooding, concentrating fertile sediment dredged from the surrounding canals onto the raised planting surface, and in some cases allowing for multiple harvests within a single year, a significant advantage in a system otherwise constrained by a single annual wet season. Constructing and maintaining these raised field systems required substantial coordinated labor, further evidence of the sophisticated organizational capacity present within classic period Maya communities. In hillier terrain, particularly in regions like the Copán Valley we visited a few segments ago, farmers made use of terracing, constructing stepped, retained planting surfaces along hillsides to reduce erosion and make more effective use of sloped land that would otherwise be poorly suited to sustained cultivation. As we touched on briefly when discussing Copán specifically, however, terracing systems, however carefully constructed, could still be overwhelmed under conditions of sustained population pressure, particularly if farmers found themselves pushed toward clearing increasingly steep, marginal, and erosion-prone slopes in order to meet the food demands of a growing population. It's worth taking a slow, unhurried moment here to consider deforestation more broadly, since this too forms an important thread running quietly beneath the more visible political history of temples, kings, and rival cities that we've spent most of our journey exploring so far. Maya cities required enormous quantities of wood, not only for household fuel and construction, but critically for the production of the lime plaster that coated nearly every significant stone building across the Maya world. Producing lime plaster requires burning limestone at high temperatures for extended periods, a process demanding substantial quantities of wood fuel. Researchers studying the environmental history of several Maya regions, drawing on evidence including preserved pollen records extracted from lake sediment cores, have documented periods of significant forest clearance across parts of the Maya lowlands during the height of the Classic period. Clearance driven by the combined demands of agricultural expansion, construction material production, and simple household fuel needs for a large and growing population. This deforestation, in turn, appears in some studied regions to have interacted with rainfall patterns in ways that modern climate researchers are still working to fully understand. Forests play an important role in regional water cycles, both through the shade and moisture retention they provide directly to soil, and through their broader influence on regional evapotranspiration, meaning the process by which water moves from soil and vegetation back into the atmosphere, where it can eventually contribute to renewed rainfall. Some researchers have proposed that substantial forest clearance across parts of the Maya lowlands may have measurably reduced regional rainfall over time, compounding whatever broader climatic pressures the region was already experiencing during this period. Though this remains an area of active and ongoing scientific research rather than a fully settled conclusion, and the degree to which human-driven deforestation, as opposed to broader natural climate variability, shaped the difficult period we'll be discussing in our coming segments, remains a genuinely open and actively studied question. For now, it's enough to simply hold this broader picture gently in mind. A civilization built with remarkable ingenuity atop a demanding, porous limestone landscape. Its farmers adapting continuously to local conditions across generations. Its engineers channeling and storing water with real sophistication. And its growing population placing steadily increasing demands on forest, soil, and water resources that had, for many centuries, proven more than sufficient to sustain a thriving civilization, but which were, by the later classic period, beginning to face pressures that no amount of accumulated engineering knowledge could entirely offset on its own. In our next segment, we'll return to the historical narrative directly, moving into the period scholars now call the Terminal Classic, when the first clear signs of significant political change began appearing across the southern Maya lowlands, beginning in specific, identifiable regions before spreading unevenly and over the course of more than a century across the wider landscape we've spent this segment quietly surveying. We come now to the period archaeologists generally refer to as the Terminal Classic, spanning roughly the years 800 to 950 of the Common Era, give or take a few decades, depending on the particular region under discussion. This is the period during which the long, complex transformation we've been gently anticipating across our earlier segments began to unfold in ways that left clear traces in the archaeological and historical record. As we move through this segment and the ones that follow, it's worth remembering something we touched on earlier. This was not a single sudden event, but rather a gradual, regionally uneven process, unfolding over roughly a century and a half, appearing first in some areas and considerably later, or not at all in the same form in others. The earliest and clearest signs of significant political change during this period appear in what researchers call the southwestern lowlands, a region including cities such as Dos Pilas, Aguatka, and other centers along the Pitaxpatan region of what is now Guatemala. This area, interestingly, was one where classic period political competition had already been particularly intense, home to some of the more consistently documented warfare of the late classic period, much of it connected in complicated and still debated ways to the broader rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul that we explored earlier in our journey. At Dos Pilas specifically, archaeological evidence reveals a striking transformation during the late 8th and early 9th centuries. The city, which earlier in its history had been an open, unfortified center organized around ceremonial plazas in the manner typical of classic period Maya cities, was extensively fortified during its final decades of occupation. Defensive walls were constructed using materials taken directly from earlier temples and monuments, a detail that speaks quite clearly to the urgency felt by the community undertaking this construction, willing to dismantle their own sacred architecture in order to repurpose the stone for defense. Eventually, even the royal palace itself was abandoned in favor of a more easily defended, naturally fortified location. And not long afterward, the site appears to have been abandoned entirely by its ruling population. This pattern of increasing fortification followed by eventual abandonment appears with local variation. Across several other centers in this same southwestern region during roughly the same window of time, researchers studying this specific area have proposed that this region may have experienced a particularly severe breakdown of the political order that had, for centuries, provided a degree of stability through established alliance networks, tribute relationships, and shared elite culture linking rival but interconnected royal courts. When that underlying political order began to fracture, for reasons that likely included some combination of the environmental pressures we discussed in our previous segment, competition over increasingly strained agricultural resources, and the simple loss of legitimacy that can follow when a ruling dynasty proves unable to protect its people or maintain the ritual and economic obligations expected of it. The resulting instability appears to have fed upon itself, with weakened cities becoming more vulnerable to rivals, and successful raids or conquests further destabilizing the wider regional network of alliances that had once provided a check against exactly this kind of runaway conflict. It's worth pausing here to sit gently with an important point about how modern researchers actually study this period, because the story is considerably more nuanced than a simple narrative of warfare alone might suggest. Skeletal evidence recovered from sites in this southwestern region during this period does show, in some locations, evidence consistent with violent death, and the archaeological record of rapid defensive fortification is itself difficult to explain without some significant escalation in the frequency or severity of conflict compared to earlier centuries. At the same time, researchers have also identified evidence at several sites in this same broader region of nutritional stress among the population in the final decades before abandonment, including skeletal indicators sometimes associated with periods of dietary insufficiency. Findings that align with the possibility that agricultural strain, whether from population pressure, environmental change, or some combination of both, was occurring alongside and quite possibly contributing directly to the political instability and conflict visible in the fortification evidence, rather than treating warfare and environmental or agricultural stress as competing, mutually exclusive explanations. Most researchers working on this period today tend to view them as interconnected factors, each capable of intensifying the other. A period of poor harvests could increase competition between neighboring polities over remaining productive land, increasing the likelihood of conflict. That conflict, once underway, could further disrupt agricultural production, as farmers found themselves unable to safely tend distant fields, or as invading forces destroyed stored grain reserves or damaged agricultural infrastructure such as reservoirs and canals. This kind of reinforcing cycle, once established, can become very difficult for even a well-organized society to break, particularly coincides with a period of unusually challenging climatic conditions, a topic we will return to more directly in our next segment, moving slightly northeast from the Pitaxpatan region toward the central Petane heartland where Tikal itself stood. We find a somewhat different, generally later, and in some ways gentler pattern of transformation. One without the same clear evidence of widespread violent conflict seen further southwest. At Tikal, the final dated monument was raised in the year 869, marking, in the traditional long count dating system that Maya scribes had used for centuries to record significant royal events, the last such inscription the city would ever produce. This does not mean Tikal's population vanished immediately in that year. Archaeological evidence indicates continued, if gradually diminishing, occupation of the city for some time afterward, with evidence suggesting that later residents, in a detail that carries a certain quiet poignancy, occupied and modified some of the old royal palace structures in ways that suggest a population living among the monuments of a grander past, without themselves possessing the same political or economic resources that had built those monuments in the first place. Calakmul, the great rival power we discussed earlier in our journey, followed a broadly similar trajectory, its own final dated monuments appearing in the early years of the 9th century, its once extensive network of allied and subordinate cities gradually dissolving as the broader political order that had sustained Calakmul's regional influence weakened alongside so many of its neighbors. It's worth taking a slow, careful moment here to address directly something that often gets flattened or oversimplified in popular retellings of this period, the phrase Maya collapse, which you may have heard before encountering this documentary, and which we will continue to use carefully throughout our remaining segments, refers specifically and primarily to the collapse of a particular political system. The network of divine, dynastic kingship and monumental urban centers that had defined the southern Maya lowlands throughout the classic period. It does not mean, and should never be understood to mean, the disappearance of the Maya people themselves, whose descendants continue to live throughout this region today, speaking Maya languages, maintaining agricultural traditions with deep historical roots, and preserving cultural and religious practices that connect, in continuous, if evolved form, back to the world we've been exploring together across these segments. We will return to this important distinction more fully in our final segments, when we consider both the northern Yucatan cities that continued to flourish well after the southern collapse, and the long continuity of Maya culture and identity that persisted and persists still, long after the last king stopped raising monuments in the southern lowland forest. Now, we can rest gently in this picture of a transformation beginning unevenly, region by region, in the southwestern lowlands first, spreading gradually northeastward across the following decades. A process that intertwined political conflict, agricultural strain, and gradually eroding royal legitimacy in ways that fed upon and reinforced one another, even as, elsewhere across the wider Maya world, life continued in cities and regions not yet touched by this particular unraveling. In our next segment, we will turn directly to the climate evidence itself, examining what modern scientific research, drawing on lake sediment cores, cave formations, and other carefully studied natural archives, can tell us about the actual environmental conditions the Maya world experienced during this critical period. In this segment, we turn to a different kind of evidence than the carved stele and dynastic inscriptions that have guided much of our journey so far. Here, our sources are not stone monuments raised by kings, but rather quiet, patient natural archives, layers of sediment settled at the bottom of ancient lakes, and mineral formations grown drop by drop within dark limestone caves, each one recording, in its own slow chemical language, something about the climate conditions present at the time it formed. There's no need to follow every scientific detail closely here. Let this segment settle into your awareness the way sediment itself settles, slowly, layer upon layer, over a very long span of time. Much of what researchers now understand about ancient Maya climate conditions comes from two main types of natural evidence. The first involves sediment cores extracted from the bottom of lakes across the Maya region, including significant work conducted at lakes such as Chichén and Punta Laguna in the northern Yucatan. As sediment accumulates on a lake bed year after year, it captures, within its mineral and chemical composition, information about the conditions present in the surrounding environment at the time each layer was deposited. Researchers can examine the ratio of different oxygen isotopes present within certain minerals in these sediment layers. Because this ratio shifts in measurable, predictable ways, depending on how much evaporation was occurring in the lake at the time, which in turn relates closely to how much rainfall the region was receiving relative to that evaporation. A drier period, with less rainfall replenishing the lake relative to evaporation, leaves a distinct and measurable chemical signature in the sediment, one that persists and can be carefully read by researchers many centuries later. The second major type of evidence comes from cave formations, specifically stalagmites, the mineral deposits that slowly build upward from cave floors over centuries as mineral-rich water drips steadily downward from the cave ceiling above. Like sediment layers in a lake, stalagmites grow in fine, incremental layers, and researchers can extract thin core samples from these formations, then analyze variations in oxygen isotopes and growth rate along the length of the sample, again providing a detailed, chronologically ordered record of rainfall conditions in the region surrounding the cave across long stretches of time. One particularly significant stalagmite record comes from a cave in southern Belize, providing an unusually detailed well-dated climate record spanning the exact centuries we've been discussing throughout this documentary. When researchers bring together evidence from multiple lake and cave sites across the Maya region, a reasonably consistent picture emerges, though with important regional variation worth noting carefully. The evidence indicates that the Maya region experienced an unusually wet, favorable climatic period during much of the earlier classic period. Conditions that would have supported robust agricultural productivity and quite plausibly contributed to the substantial population growth documented archaeologically across the Maya lowlands during these centuries, beginning in the 8th century and continuing with particular intensity through the 9th and into portions of the 10th century. However, multiple independent climate records point toward a period of significantly reduced rainfall, understood by researchers to represent one of the more severe and sustained drought periods to affect the region within at least the preceding several thousand years. Based on the longer-term climate records, these same lake and cave sites are able to provide. It's important, in the spirit of careful, calm accuracy that we've tried to maintain throughout this documentary, to note that this was not understood by researchers as a single uniform drought lasting continuously for a century and a half. Rather, the evidence suggests a pattern of multiple distinct drought episodes, some more severe than others, interspersed with periods of partially recovered, though generally still below historical average, rainfall. Some researchers studying these records in detail have identified particularly severe individual drought episodes clustering around specific decades, including periods in the early 8th century, the middle of the 9th century, and again toward the end of the 10th century, each of which corresponds, with notable though not perfect precision, to periods of documented political disruption at specific Maya cities across the affected regions. This correspondence between climate and political history deserves a careful, unhurried moment of reflection, because it would be an oversimplification, one that careful researchers in this field generally avoid, to say simply that drought caused the collapse of classic Maya civilization in any direct, singular sense. The relationship appears considerably more complex and more interesting than that. Consider, for a moment, everything we've discussed across our earlier segments. A civilization that had grown over centuries of favorable climate to a population density that pushed the limits of what the surrounding agricultural land could sustainably support, even under good rainfall conditions. A civilization that had, in many regions, cleared substantial forest cover to support this population, potentially further reducing regional rainfall through the kind of vegetation feedback effects we discussed in our previous segment. A civilization organized politically around numerous independent, competing city-states, whose rulers derived much of their legitimacy from an implicit promise to maintain agricultural prosperity and divine favor on behalf of their people. Introduce into this already finely balanced system a sustained period of significantly reduced and unpredictable rainfall, and the resulting strain becomes considerably easier to understand, not as a single dramatic cause, but as a serious, sustained pressure applied to a system that had, in several important respects, already reduced its own capacity to absorb such a shock. Agricultural systems dependent on reliable seasonal rainfall, which, as we discussed in our previous segment, described the great majority of Maya farming across the lowlands, would have faced repeated, serious challenges during these drought decades. Reservoirs, so carefully engineered at cities like Tikal, specifically to buffer against normal seasonal dry periods, would have struggled considerably more against multi-year droughts, extending well beyond what their storage capacity had been designed to reliably absorb. Reduced harvests, occurring not just in a single difficult year, but repeatedly across a period of several consecutive difficult years, would have placed mounting strain on stored food reserves, on the ability of common farming families to meet both their own subsistence needs and the tribute obligations owed to their rulers, and quite plausibly on the underlying political legitimacy of rulers who had, for generations, presented themselves as capable of maintaining divine favor and agricultural prosperity through their ritual and ceremonial obligations. It's worth pausing to notice, gently, how this climate evidence connects back to the patterns we observed in our previous segment regarding the southwestern lowlands, specifically the Pitaxbatan region, where we saw such clear evidence of fortification, conflict, and relatively early abandonment, sits within a part of the Maya lowlands that climate researchers have identified as having been particularly vulnerable to reduced rainfall. Given its specific local hydrology and its historical dependence on rain-fed rather than river-fed water sources, this alignment between regions showing early climate stress and regions showing early political instability offers one important thread of supporting evidence for researchers working to understand how these different factors interacted. Though, as we've emphasized throughout this segment, the relationship remains a genuinely complex one, still actively studied and refined as new climate records and new archaeological evidence continue to become available. It's also worth noting, with the same careful, unhurried honesty we've tried to maintain throughout this documentary, that not every region of the Maya world experienced this drought period with equal severity, and not every Maya city responded to whatever challenges it did face in the same way. Some cities, as we've already seen with Copán and will see further in coming segments, appear to have faced additional, more locally specific pressures, such as the soil erosion evidence we discussed earlier, layered on top of whatever broader regional climate trends were also occurring. Other regions, particularly in the northern Yucatan Peninsula, which we will visit directly in a later segment, seem to have weathered this same general climatic period rather differently, in ways connected to both their specific local environment and their particular political and economic circumstances during these same challenging centuries. For now, we can rest in this picture of patient scientific evidence, drawn not from carved stone, but from lake mud and cave mineral, each layer recording, in its own slow chemical language, a story of gradually reduced and increasingly unpredictable rainfall settling over a civilization that had, through many generations of remarkable ingenuity, built itself right up to the edge of what its landscape could sustainably support, leaving considerably less room to absorb the kind of sustained environmental pressure that the climate record now shows this region experienced across the 9th and 10th centuries. In our next segment, we will return to the human story directly, examining how these environmental pressures, layered together with the political dynamics we explored in earlier segments, manifested in the specific pattern of warfare, fragmentation, and shifting alliance that characterized so much of the terminal classic period across the wider southern lowlands. Having spent our previous segment among lake sediments and cave formations, tracing the quiet chemical evidence of a changing climate, we return now to the human world directly, to consider how the political structures we explored earlier in our journey, the great rivalries, the dynastic marriages, the careful webs of alliance connecting cities across the southern lowlands, responded as the pressures we've been discussing continued to mount across the 9th century. As always, there is no need to hold tightly to every specific detail here. Let the broader shape of this gradual unraveling settle gently into your awareness. Classic period Maya political stability, as we discussed earlier in our journey, rested on several interlocking foundations. It rested on the ability of ruling dynasties to maintain their claimed connection to sacred ancestral legitimacy, reinforced through public ceremony, monument construction, and ritual bloodletting performed by the king on behalf of the wider community. It rested on functioning trade networks, moving goods like jade, obsidian, salt, and cacao across long distances, generating wealth and interdependence between distant cities. And it rested on a delicate, ever-shifting web of alliance and rivalry between competing royal courts, a system that, while certainly capable of producing conflict, as we saw with the long Tikal Calakmul rivalry, generally operated within certain understood limits that helped prevent any single localized conflict from spiraling into wider, more chaotic instability as agricultural strain increased across the 9th century, driven by the drought conditions and accumulated environmental pressures we discussed in our previous 2 segments. Each of these interlocking foundations appears to have come under increasing stress in ways that, over time, reinforced one another. Reduced agricultural surplus meant reduced capacity for rulers to sponsor the grand ceremonial feasts, building projects, and gift exchanges that had traditionally reinforced their political legitimacy and their alliance relationships with neighboring courts. Reduced trade as economic strain rippled across interconnected regional networks, further weakened the wealth and prestige that rulers depended upon to maintain their authority. And as individual rulers found their traditional sources of legitimacy and authority increasingly strained, the careful balance of power that had, for centuries, generally kept conflict between rival courts within manageable limits appears to have become considerably harder to maintain. The archaeological evidence for increased conflict during this period extends well beyond the Pitaxbatan region we discussed specifically in an earlier segment. Across multiple areas of the southern and central lowlands, researchers have documented an increase during the terminal classic period, specifically in defensive architecture at sites that had shown little or no such fortification during earlier centuries. This includes walls constructed around site cores, moats or ditches dug at strategic points, and the strategic repositioning of settlement toward more easily defended locations, often on higher ground or surrounded by natural defensive features such as steep terrain or water. This pattern, appearing across numerous sites that otherwise shared relatively little direct political connection to one another, suggests something broader than a single regional conflict, pointing instead toward a more widespread breakdown in the assumptions of relative security that had characterized much of the earlier classic period across the southern lowlands. Generally, it's worth taking a slow, careful moment here to consider what this kind of widespread instability would have actually meant for ordinary people living through it. Since our historical sources, drawn overwhelmingly from royal inscriptions commissioned by kings to record their own achievements, tend naturally to foreground the perspective and concerns of the ruling class rather than the broader population. For farming families, increasing regional instability would likely have meant growing uncertainty about whether crops planted in more distant or exposed fields could be safely harvested, growing difficulty in maintaining the kind of longer distance trade relationships that had previously allowed communities to supplement local production with goods obtained from further afield. And for communities located nearer to the more directly affected conflict zones, the very real possibility of displacement, as families made the difficult decision to leave communities that no longer offered reliable safety or agricultural stability in search of a more secure situation elsewhere. This pattern of displacement and gradual population movement deserves particular attention because it connects directly to something we'll examine more fully in our next segment, when we turn to consider the archaeological evidence for population decline across the southern lowlands during this period. For now, it's worth simply noting, gently, that population decline in a region does not necessarily mean, in every case, that the people who once lived there had died in place. In many documented cases across this period, the evidence instead points toward gradual outmigration. Families and smaller communities relocating toward regions that appeared, at the time, to offer more stable conditions, whether that meant moving toward cities that had not yet experienced the same degree of political and agricultural strain, or in some cases, moving toward entirely different regions of the wider Maya world, including, as we'll discuss in a later segment, portions of the northern Yucatan Peninsula that continued to flourish during this same general period. The dissolution of the Great Alliance networks that had structured much of classic period Maya politics deserves its own careful, unhurried mention here as well. The Conal dynasty of Calakmul, whose extensive network of alliances and subordinate relationships we discussed earlier in our journey, appears to have lost much of its wider regional influence during the terminal classic period. Its once extensive web of allied courts gradually dissolving as those individual cities faced their own local pressures and increasingly found themselves unable, or perhaps simply unwilling, to maintain the kind of tribute and political obligations that had previously bound them to Calakmul's wider network, without the stabilizing, if occasionally exploitative, structure that these larger alliance networks had once provided. Individual smaller kingdoms appear, in many documented cases, to have found themselves increasingly isolated, forced to negotiate their own security and resource needs without the wider network of support and obligation that had previously offered a degree of protection against exactly the kind of localized crisis so many of them now faced. It's important, in the spirit of careful balance that we've tried to maintain throughout this documentary, to note clearly that this pattern of fragmentation, while genuinely widespread across the southern lowlands during this period, was neither absolutely uniform nor absolutely universal. Some cities, even within regions experiencing significant wider instability, managed to maintain relative stability for longer periods than their neighbors, whether through particularly effective local leadership, particularly favorable local environmental conditions, or simply good fortune in avoiding the more severe conflicts affecting nearby communities. Other cities that we haven't yet had the chance to discuss directly in our journey together continued producing dated monuments and maintaining recognizable political structures well into the 10th century, considerably later than many of their neighbors, illustrating once again the genuinely uneven, regionally variable nature of this transformation that we've emphasized throughout our documentary. We should also take a slow, careful moment to note that warfare and political fragmentation during this period, however serious and however genuinely disruptive to the established classic period political order, should not be understood or imagined in the terms of large-scale industrial or modern conflict. Maya warfare during this period, like the warfare we discussed in earlier, more stable centuries, generally involved relatively small numbers of combatants by later historical standards, fought largely with weapons such as spears, atlatls, and obsidian-edged blades, and organized around goals that, even amid growing desperation, likely still involved considerable elements of the older, more ritualized approach to conflict we discussed earlier in our journey, alongside newer, more directly resource-driven motivations connected to the agricultural and economic strain the whole region was experiencing. As we bring this segment to its close, it's worth resting for a moment in the broader picture we've assembled together across this portion of our journey, a civilization whose intricate political structure, built up carefully over many centuries of dynastic marriage, ritual obligation, and delicately balanced rivalry, gradually came under increasing strain as the environmental pressures we explored in earlier segments compounded, region by region, into a widening pattern of fortification, conflict, and fragmenting alliance across much of the southern lowlands during the 9th and into the early 10th centuries. This was not the end of Maya civilization, and it was certainly not the end of the Maya people, a point we will return to more fully in our closing segments. But it was, for the great cities of the southern lowlands specifically, cities like Tikal, Calakmul, Copán, and Palenque, that we walked through so carefully at the beginning of our journey together. A period of profound and largely irreversible political transformation. In our next segment, we will turn to consider directly the archaeological evidence for population change across this same period, examining what careful, patient settlement surveys and skeletal analysis can tell us about how many people actually lived through this transformation, and what ultimately became of the great cities they left behind. We turn now to one of the more quietly moving aspects of this long story, the gradual emptying of the great cities we spent our earlier segments walking through together. There's no need to brace yourself for anything dramatic here. What the evidence actually shows is less a sudden vanishing and more a slow, uneven fading. A population declining gradually across generations rather than disappearing in any single moment. And it's this gentler, more gradual picture that we'll spend this segment carefully exploring. Much of what researchers know about population change during this period comes from a particular kind of patient, painstaking archaeological work known as settlement survey, in which researchers systematically map and, where possible, excavate not just the grand ceremonial core of a city, but the surrounding residential zones, the modest house platforms where ordinary families actually lived, in order to build a fuller picture of how many people actually inhabited a given region at different points in time. By carefully dating pottery fragments and other everyday artifacts recovered from these residential contexts, researchers can trace, with reasonable though never perfect precision, how the density of occupied households in a given region changed across the centuries we've been discussing throughout this documentary. This kind of detailed settlement survey work, conducted across numerous sites throughout the southern Maya lowlands, over several decades of dedicated archaeological research, reveals a consistent, though gradual pattern. Population in the core southern lowland regions, including the areas surrounding Tikal, Calakmul, and many of the smaller cities and towns that had once filled the spaces between these larger centers, appears to have reached its peak sometime in the 8th century, before beginning a decline that continued, with regional variation in both timing and severity, across the 9th and into the 10th centuries. In some of the more severely affected regions, particularly the southwestern lowlands we discussed in relation to the Pitaxpatan conflicts, researchers estimate that population may have declined by somewhere in the range of 80 to 90% across a period of roughly a century. An extraordinarily significant demographic change, the one that unfolded, importantly, across multiple generations rather than within a single human lifetime, which matters considerably for how we should imagine the lived experience of the people involved. It's worth taking a slow, careful moment to sit with what this actually would have meant for the people living through it, generation by generation, rather than trying to grasp the full scale of the change all at once. A person born in the early 9th century in one of the affected southern lowland cities might have grown up amid a community still very much functioning, still holding markets, still observing ritual calendar ceremonies, even if the grandest new temple construction projects of earlier generations had begun to slow. That same person, by later in their life, might have witnessed neighboring households gradually relocating elsewhere, might have noticed local markets growing thinner, offering fewer goods from increasingly strained long-distance trade networks, and might eventually have faced the difficult decision, shared by so many families across this region during these decades, of whether to remain in a community facing increasing hardship, or to relocate toward a region that seemed to offer more stable conditions. Their own children, born perhaps in the middle of the 9th century, might have grown up in an already noticeably smaller community, one where empty, no longer maintained house platforms had become an increasingly familiar part of the landscape, gradually being reclaimed by encroaching vegetation. This generational, gradual quality helps explain something that can otherwise seem puzzling about this period. The fact that royal monuments generally stopped being erected considerably earlier than the point at which cities were fully abandoned. As we discussed in earlier segments, Tikal's final dated monument was raised in 869. Yet, archaeological evidence indicates some continued occupation of the city for a period afterward, just as we noted for several other cities across our journey. This gap between the end of formal royal monument construction and the point of final, complete abandonment reflects the underlying reality that the collapse of divine kingship as a political and religious institution, which which required specific ceremonial, economic, and ideological conditions to function, and which appears to have broken down relatively rapidly under the pressures we've discussed across recent segments, was a distinct process from the complete depopulation of a given city or region, which generally unfolded more slowly, as remaining residents gradually made their own individual and family decisions about whether to stay or relocate. Decisions likely influenced by considerations of local agricultural viability, ongoing security, and the presence or absence of surviving kin and community networks in a given location. Skeletal evidence recovered from this period across multiple sites offers additional insight, and it's worth mentioning this evidence gently and factually, in keeping with the calm tone we've maintained throughout this documentary. Researchers studying human remains from the Terminal Classic period at various southern lowland sites have documented, in several, though not all studied populations, evidence consistent with nutritional stress, including indicators sometimes associated with childhood malnutrition or periods of dietary insufficiency. Findings broadly consistent with the agricultural strain we discussed in earlier segments regarding drought conditions and their impact on regional food production. It's worth noting, with appropriate scholarly caution, that skeletal evidence of this kind can be difficult to interpret with complete precision, and researchers continue to refine their understanding of exactly how representative particular skeletal samples are of the wider population's experience during this period. Still, taken together with the settlement survey evidence, the architectural fortification evidence discussed in our previous segment, and the climate evidence discussed 2 segments ago, this skeletal evidence contributes to a broadly consistent picture of a population experiencing genuine, sustained hardship across these transformative decades, as populations declined and eventually departed from many of these southern lowland cities. The surrounding tropical forest, which Maya communities had spent centuries actively managing, clearing, and cultivating, began the long, slow process of reclaiming the spaces that human activity had previously kept open. Tree roots gradually worked their way between the stones of unmaintained plazas and temple staircases. Fallen leaves and organic material accumulated across abandoned house platforms, eventually forming new soil layers atop what had once been swept, carefully maintained courtyards. Over subsequent centuries, this process continued until many of the cities we've walked through together across this documentary lay hidden beneath dense forest canopy, their temples appearing, to later visitors, less as constructed monuments and more as unusually regular, tree-covered hills rising from the surrounding jungle floor, their true nature only rediscovered through the careful, patient work of the archaeologists and explorers who began systematically documenting these sites in more recent centuries. It's worth pausing gently to note that this reclamation by forest, while it can carry a certain melancholy quality when we consider it from our present vantage point, also reflects something important about the resilience and continuity of the broader ecological and cultural landscape of the region. The forest that grew up around these abandoned cities was not an entirely wild, untouched wilderness in the way that phrase might suggest, but rather a landscape that continued to be used in more dispersed and lower density ways by Maya communities who remained in the region, descendants of the same broader cultural tradition we've been exploring throughout this documentary, adapting their settlement patterns and agricultural practices to a changed political and demographic landscape, while maintaining, in continuous, if evolved form, many of the deeper cultural, linguistic, and agricultural traditions that connected them to the world of their ancestors. This point deserves real emphasis as we approach the closing segments of our documentary together. The decline of the great classic period cities of the southern lowlands represented a profound transformation of a particular political and urban system, but it did not represent the disappearance of the Maya people who continued and continue today to live throughout this broader region, maintaining a cultural continuity that stretches back through many changes and adaptations to the world of farmers, scribes, and rulers we've spent this documentary carefully exploring together. In our final segment together, we will travel north to the Yucatan Peninsula, where a rather different story was unfolding during these same challenging centuries, before drawing our journey to its gentle, unhurried close with some reflection on how this long, complex transformation continues to be studied, understood, and reconsidered by researchers today. For this final segment of our journey together, we travel north, up into the Yucatan Peninsula, to a part of the Maya world that experienced these same challenging centuries quite differently from the southern lowland cities we've spent so much of our documentary exploring. If you've stayed with us this long, there's nothing more you need to hold onto from earlier segments to follow this closing part of our journey. We can simply arrive here together in a landscape of low scrub forest and flat limestone plain, quite different from the tall rainforest canopy of the southern lowlands, and let this final chapter unfold gently at its own unhurried pace. The northern Yucatan Peninsula presents a notably different environment from the southern lowlands in several important respects. Rainfall in this northern region is generally somewhat lower, and in the very northernmost areas, considerably more limited. But the peninsula's particular geology includes an unusually high concentration of cenotes, those natural limestone sinkholes we discussed briefly in an earlier segment, providing more reliable access to groundwater in certain locations than was available across much of the southern lowlands. This environmental difference meant that northern cities faced a somewhat different set of environmental constraints and opportunities than their southern counterparts, and it appears to have contributed alongside other economic and political factors, to a rather different historical trajectory during the very centuries when the southern cities were experiencing the transformation we explored across our previous several segments. Chichén Itzá stands as the most prominent example of this northern continuity, and, in certain respects, flourishing during this period. The city rose to particular prominence during roughly the same span of centuries when so many southern lowland cities were experiencing the political fragmentation and population decline we discussed earlier. Reaching its height of influence and construction activity across the 9th and 10th centuries, Chichén Itzá's architecture reflects a distinctive blending of traditional Maya building styles with artistic and architectural elements that show clear connections to Central Mexican traditions, most notably associated with the Toltec civilization centered at Tula, far to the northwest. Researchers continue to discuss and refine their understanding of exactly how this connection came about, whether through direct migration of people from central Mexico, through trade and cultural exchange without large-scale population movement, or through some combination of these and other factors. But the architectural evidence itself, including features such as the reclining Calakmul figures and feathered serpent imagery found throughout the site, clearly reflects a Maya city deeply engaged with wider Mesoamerican political and religious currents, extending well beyond the traditional boundaries of the Maya cultural sphere we explored throughout most of our earlier segments. Chichén Itzá's economic foundation appears to have rested significantly on its role within long-distance trade networks, including maritime trade routes that connected the Yucatan coast with other regions of Mesoamerica, and, in some documented cases, connections extending toward Central America as well. The city's inland location was connected to a coastal port site, allowing Chichén Itzá to participate actively in this wider trading world, exchanging goods including salt, a resource particularly abundant along certain stretches of the Yucatan coast, and valuable throughout the wider Mesoamerican world for goods produced elsewhere. This economic orientation toward wider Mesoamerican trade networks, rather than the more regionally self-contained political and economic system that had characterized much of the southern lowlands during the height of the Classic period, may have offered Chichén Itzá a degree of continued economic vitality, even as the older southern lowland trade and political networks were experiencing the disruption we discussed in earlier segments. Chichén Itzá's own period of greatest prominence did not last indefinitely, and the city itself experienced a significant decline in influence during the 11th or 12th century, according to most current scholarly understanding, though the precise chronology and causes of this decline remain, like so much of the material we've discussed throughout this documentary, subject to ongoing research and scholarly discussion. Following this decline, political prominence within the northern Yucatan shifted toward a new center, the city of Mayapán, which rose to regional prominence during the 13th century and maintained a significant degree of political influence across much of the northern peninsula for roughly 2 centuries afterward. Organized around a somewhat different political structure than the divine kingship model that had characterized classic period cities, involving instead a kind of confederated council of noble lineages, sharing power more broadly than the more centralized royal courts of earlier centuries. It's worth taking a slow, reflective moment here to consider what this northern continuity tells us about the broader story we've been exploring throughout this documentary. The fact that Maya civilization continued to produce large, politically significant, architecturally impressive cities in the northern Yucatan for centuries after the great southern lowland centers had faded reinforces something we touched on earlier and want to state clearly and gently one final time as we bring our journey to its close. What occurred in the southern lowlands during the 8th through 10th centuries represented the transformation and eventual dissolution of a particular political and urban system in a particular region, shaped by that region's particular environmental constraints, historical trajectory, and accumulated internal pressures. It did not represent the ending of Maya civilization as a whole, which continued to develop, adapt, and in certain respects flourish in other parts of the Maya world for centuries afterward, right up until the arrival of Spanish colonizers in the 16th century brought an entirely different and, in its own way, far more abrupt set of challenges to Maya civilization across the region as a whole, a history that extends well beyond the scope of what we've been able to explore together in this particular documentary, and even beyond the Spanish colonial period, which itself brought profound disruption, violence, and loss to Maya communities across the region. Maya civilization did not end. Millions of people throughout southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and neighboring countries today identify as Maya, speaking any of more than 24 related Maya languages that continue to be used in daily life, religious practice, and increasingly in contemporary literature, education, and media as well. Traditional agricultural practices connected in continuous, if evolved form, to the farming techniques we discussed earlier in our documentary, continue to be practiced by Maya farming communities today. Traditional ceremonial practices, blending pre-Columbian religious traditions with elements introduced during the colonial period, continue to be observed in many Maya communities, and the archaeological sites we've walked through together across this documentary, Tikal, Calakmul, Copán, Palenque, and the northern cities we've discussed in this closing segment, continue to be understood by many contemporary Maya people, not simply as ancient ruins studied by outside researchers, but as meaningful ancestral sites connected to their own continuous cultural heritage and identity. As we bring our long, unhurried journey together to its gentle close, it's worth reflecting for a moment on how our understanding of this history has itself continued to change and deepen over recent decades. Much of what we've discussed throughout this documentary, the detailed dynastic histories recorded on stele and hieroglyphic stairways, the specific names and reigns of individual rulers, the nuanced understanding of classic period warfare and its ritual dimensions, has become available to researchers only relatively recently, following major advances in the decipherment of Maya hieroglyphic writing that occurred substantially within the past several decades. Earlier generations of researchers working before these decipherment advances understood Maya civilization considerably less clearly, sometimes imagining classic period society as more uniformly peaceful than the epigraphic and archaeological evidence now available demonstrates it actually was. And lacking access to the detailed historical narratives that hieroglyphic decipherment has since made available. Similarly, much of the climate evidence we discussed several segments ago has become available only through scientific techniques and research programs developed and refined within recent decades as well. This history, in other words, continues to be actively written and revised, not because earlier researchers were careless, but because our tools for understanding this deep and genuinely complex history continue to improve, offering each generation of researchers a somewhat clearer, somewhat more nuanced picture than the generation before. There is a certain fitting quality, perhaps, in closing our documentary with this reflection on continued, patient scholarly revision, because it mirrors something of the broader story we've spent so many hours together exploring. A civilization that adapted continuously to its landscape across many centuries, that experienced genuine transformation and genuine loss during the period we focused on most closely, and that nonetheless persisted in continuous and evolving form into the present day. If you're still with us at this point, deep into the night, perhaps drifting in and out of the story by now, there's nothing more required of you than simply resting here in this final quiet image. Forest-covered temples standing patiently in the humid morning air, their carved stairways slowly being reclaimed by moss and root, while nearby, in villages and towns across the same broad landscape, the descendants of the people who built them continue, in their own contemporary way, a story that began many centuries ago, and in its own quiet, continuous form, has never actually ended. Thank you for spending this time with us. Rest well.